Drove to the hospital that afternoon telling myself I just needed to look him in the eye. That was all. No confrontation, no scene. Just look at the man my wife had been meeting for the last 8 months and see what kind of person he was. I had pictured him 100 times, younger than me probably, confident. The kind of guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him. I had the whole thing scripted in my head. Walk in, introduce myself, watch his face go white, walk out. Clean. Done. What I was not prepared for was the moment I pushed open that hospital room door and stopped breathing entirely. My name is not important right now, but I'll tell you what matters. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years working as a civil engineer for the county. I coached Little League for 11 seasons, and I genuinely believed that I knew everything worth knowing about my own life. I had made peace with a lot of things. My knees don't work the way they used to. My hair is more gray than brown. My daughter lives 3 states away and calls on Sundays. These were the contours of my existence, and I was fine with them. My wife's name is Loretta. We had been married for 26 years. I found out about the other man the way most people do. Not through any dramatic revelation, not through a private detective or a lipstick on a collar. I found out because she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to get the laundry, and a message came through from a contact saved as Dr. Whitmore that said, "Miss you already." Last night was everything. I stood there with a dish towel in my hand and read those 6 words 4 times. She came back into the kitchen 30 seconds later, and I had already put the phone face down where I found it. I don't know why I did that. Instinct, maybe. Some part of me that wasn't ready yet, that needed time to process what those words meant before I blew up 26 years of a life we had built together. I went to bed that night and I lay there in the dark next to her and I thought, how long? That question ate me alive for the next 3 weeks. I became someone I didn't recognize. I started checking her mileage. I memorized her schedule and then quietly verified it. I went through our credit card statements on the family laptop while she was at her book club, which turned out to actually be book club, which somehow made the whole thing lonelier. She was lying about one thing. Everything else was exactly what she said it was. She still made coffee for both of us every morning. She still reached for my hand during commercials. Whatever was happening with Dr. Whitmore, she had apparently decided that the rest of our life could continue on as normal, and I could not figure out which part of that disturbed me more. I eventually found out his name through a sequence of careful, humiliating steps I'm not proud of. He wasn't a doctor. The contact name was just camouflage. His name was Adrian. He was 44 years old. He worked at a marketing firm downtown. He lived alone in a condo near the waterfront, the kind of building with a gym on the 4th floor and a rooftop deck, and a doorman who probably sees a lot and says nothing. I drove past the building twice. Just drove past. I didn't stop. I want to be honest about where I was emotionally during those weeks, because I think people expect a man in my situation to be furious, and fury was certainly part of it. But the larger part, the part that kept me awake at 3 a.m., was something closer to bewilderment. I kept trying to find the moment where I had failed. The specific turning point where Loretta had looked at her life and found it lacking enough to go looking somewhere else. I replayed arguments. I replayed arguments. I replayed vacations. I replayed ordinary Tuesday evenings and tried to find the fault line. I couldn't find it. And not finding it almost made it worse. I had decided in those sleepless weeks that I was going to confront him directly before I said anything to Loretta. I needed to see him first. I needed to understand on some gut level what I was actually dealing with, whether this was some foolish midlife thing that had already burned itself out, or whether my wife was genuinely in love with someone else and I was the last to know. Then I got the call. My daughter phoned me on a Thursday afternoon while I was in a parking lot eating a sandwich. She sounded strange, careful, the way she gets when she's choosing every word. She told me that a man named Adrian had been in a serious car accident 2 days earlier and was currently at Mercy General in the ICU. She paused. Then she said, "Dad, I think you need to know who he is." I went very still in that car. She knew, My daughter knew about her mother and this man and had apparently known for at least a month and had been trying to figure out how to tell me. She was crying by the end of the call. She kept saying she was sorry, that she didn't know what to do, that she didn't want to be the one to destroy our family. I told her she hadn't destroyed anything. I told her none of this was her fault. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat in that parking lot for probably 40 minutes. Then I drove to Mercy General. I told myself, the whole drive there, that I was going in to see a man who had been sleeping with my wife. That was the fact I was holding on to. That was the narrative I had constructed. I was wrong husband. He was the interloper, and I was going to walk into that room and take one long look at him, and then I was going to know what to do next. I parked the car. I walked through the main entrance. I asked at the front desk for his room. The woman at the desk looked at me and said, "Are you family?" I said yes without thinking. She gave me the room number. 4th floor. The elevator was slow. I watched the numbers change and I thought about Loretta making coffee that morning, sliding my mug across the counter without being asked, the way she had done almost every day for 26 years. I thought about what I was walking toward and what I would do with whatever I found there. I stepped off on the 4th floor and followed the numbers down the hallway. Room 422. I put my hand on the door handle, took one breath, pushed it open, and then I stood in the doorway of that hospital room and the floor dropped out from underneath me because the man in that bed did not look like a stranger. He was pale, thinner than he probably normally was, one arm connected to an IV, a monitor tracking his heartbeat with a soft, steady beep. His eyes were closed. There were bruises along the left side of his face, but his jawline, the shape of his brow, the way his dark hair fell slightly to the left. I know that face. Not because I had ever met this man. I hadn't. I was certain of that. But I know that face the way you know something that lives in your own mirror. The way you recognize a feature you've seen in photographs and home videos, in a 5-year-old school pictures that you kept in your wallet for a decade. My hands were shaking. I took 2 steps into the room and then I stopped because my legs stopped working. There is a version of this story that I could not have told you 3 weeks ago because I didn't have all the pieces. But let me give you the pieces now, in the order I eventually came to understand them. 27 years ago, before I met Loretta, I was with someone else. Her name was Paula. We were young. I was 29, she was 26, and we were together for about a year and a half. It ended badly. She moved to Portland. I stayed here, and that was that. Except that 6 months after we broke up, she called me and told me she was pregnant. She said the baby was mine. She also said she wasn't keeping it. She had already made her decision, and she was telling me as a courtesy, not a request for input. I was devastated. I argued. I offered everything I could think of, money, involvement, whatever she needed. She was unmovable. She said she was placing the baby for adoption, and she didn't want me involved, and if I tried to get in the way, she had spoken to a lawyer and knew her options. I didn't fight it. I was 29 years old, and I didn't know how to fight it. I signed whatever I was asked to sign, and I told myself that the child would have a good family and a better life than I could give on my own, and I buried that grief so deep that by the time I met Loretta, it had become something I could breathe around. I never told Loretta, not in 26 years. I had thought about it. Several times in the early years I came close, but there never seemed to be a right moment, and then enough time passed that the silence felt like its own kind of answer. I stood in that hospital room, and I looked at this man, 44 years old, born in Portland, adopted as an infant, and I knew. I knew with the absolute, irrational, unscientific certainty of a parent who has spent 30 years wondering about a face he never got to see grow up. That was my son in that bed. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough that a nurse came in behind me and asked quietly if everything was okay. I said yes. My voice came out of me from very far away. I pulled a chair to the side of the bed and I sat down. He was sedated, the nurse told me. He had been brought in following a serious collision on the interstate. He was stable now, but had been touch and go for the first 12 hours. She asked again if I was family. I said he was my son, The word came out of my mouth before I could stop it, and then I just let it stand there, because it was the most honest thing I had said in a long time. She left us alone. I sat next to him for a long time. I looked at his hands, long fingers, the same as mine. I looked at the line of his nose. I thought about all the ways a person carries their biology without knowing it, the features that surface decades later in a stranger's face and announce themselves without permission. Loretta had known. That thought arrived slowly, like a cold front moving in. She had been with this man for 8 months. 8 months of Dr. Whitmore and careful lies and reaching for my hand during commercials. She had looked at him, really looked at him, and she had seen what I was seeing now, or something close to it. Maybe she had noticed his age and done the math. Maybe he had mentioned being adopted. Maybe she had simply held that knowledge somewhere inside herself and kept going, because the alternative was a conversation that would end everything. I sat there and I tried to understand the shape of it. A woman who discovers that the man she is having an affair with may be her husband's biological son and chooses not to say anything. Chooses, in fact, to continue. I could not get there. I turned it around in my mind from every angle, and I could not get to a place where that made sense to me. He stirred once while I was sitting there. His eyes didn't open, but his hand moved slightly on the blanket. I almost reached out. I stopped myself. I sat very still, and I watched him breathe, and I thought, what do you do with a truth like this? There were things I needed to consider. He was a grown man, 44 years old, with a life and a job, and presumably people who cared about him. He had no reason to know I existed. His parents, whoever they were, had raised him. He had his own history. My biology was an accident he had been spared from knowing about, and I had to ask myself whether disrupting that, walking into a hospital room and introducing myself as his father, was something I had the right to do. I also had to consider my daughter, my real, present, grown daughter who had called me in a parking lot crying because she didn't want to be the one to tell me. She had known about her mother's affair and had been carrying it alone for a month. Whatever I decided to do next, she was going to be standing in the wreckage of it. I had to consider Loretta. I sat there for nearly 2 hours. A different nurse came in and checked his monitors and left without saying much. The afternoon light shifted through the window. His heartbeat stayed steady on the screen. When I finally stood up, I knew two things. The first was that I was going to tell him. Not that day. He was sedated. He didn't know I was there, and there were things I needed to sort through before I could have that conversation responsibly. I needed to find his adoption records, or at least confirm what I already knew in my bones. I needed to think about how a person says, "I'm your biological father, and I didn't know you existed until an hour ago, and the woman you've been seeing is my wife." I needed to think about what kind of support I could offer when that landed on him, because it was going to land hard. But I was going to tell him. I was clear on that. He deserved to know where he came from. Not to devastate him, but because the alternative was leaving him with a lie he didn't even know he was living inside. The second thing I knew was that my marriage was over. Not in anger. Not in a blaze of confrontation or revenge. The marriage was simply over the way a building is over once its foundation is gone. You can still see the wall standing, but you know. I had looked at my wife and found a version of her I didn't recognize and couldn't unsee. Whatever she had told herself to justify what she'd done, whatever logic she had used to keep going, to keep reaching for my hand during commercials, I couldn't carry that and also be okay. I drove home. Loretta was in the kitchen when I got there. She had started dinner. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary, the way it does when she makes the roast chicken she's been making since the early years, the one I've always told her was my favorite. She turned when I came in and smiled at me. Genuine, warm, the smile of a woman who believed the afternoon had gone like every other afternoon. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen and I looked at her for a long moment. Then I sat down at the table and I said, "I went to see Adrian today." The color left her face in an instant. I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I told her what I had found. I told her about the chair next to the hospital bed. I told her about his hands and his jawline and the shape of his brow. I watched her try to find words and fail and try again. She admitted it, all of it, the affair, and what she had noticed and the silence she had chosen. She said she didn't know how to tell me. She said she had convinced herself she might be wrong. She said a lot of things that I listened to and tried to hold fairly, because she was my wife of 26 years and she was a human being having the worst night of her life. And fairness felt like the last thing I had to offer. At the end of it, she asked me what I was going to do. I told her I was going to find my son. The divorce took about 14 months. It wasn't hateful. We divided things quietly, with lawyers who kept things civil, and we came out the other side without destroying each other, which, under the circumstances, I consider a kind of grace. My daughter took it hard, but she took it honestly, the way she takes most difficult things. We talked a lot that year, more than we had in a long time. I spent 6 weeks working with an adoption registry and a DNA service before I had the confirmation I already knew was coming. His name was Adrian Cole. He had been adopted at 3 months old by a couple in Beaverton, Oregon, Oregon. Good people, from what I was later able to understand. He had grown up well-loved and well-provided for. He had gone to college in California, built a career, moved here about 5 years ago. He had never searched for his biological parents. He had never had reason to. He was out of the hospital by the time I reached out. I wrote him a letter first. 8 drafts over 3 weeks before I sent the one that felt honest, without being overwhelming. I told him I believed I was his biological father. I told him about Paula and about 1980 and about a decision I was 29 years old and unequipped to fight. I told him I wasn't reaching out to disrupt his life or claim anything from him. I told him he could throw the letter away and I would never contact him again, and I would understand completely. I also told him, as plainly as I could, that if he ever wanted to know where he came from, I was here. He called me 11 days later. His voice was careful, measured. He said he'd read the letter 4 times. He said he'd done the DNA test I had included a kit for, and he was looking at the results on his phone while we talked. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know what to do with this." I said, "That's okay. Neither do I. We can figure it out slowly." He didn't hang up. We talked for 45 minutes about nothing much. His job, my engineering work, a fishing trip I'd taken years ago to Montana, small things, safe things. The kind of conversation where you're not really talking about what you're talking about, but you're building something anyway. One careful sentence at a time. There's something I think about often now, about the particular cruelty of the way all this came to pass, that I had to find him through a wound, through the worst breach of trust in my marriage, through a series of accidents that should never have intersected. He didn't deserve to be discovered that way. Neither did I, neither did my daughter, who had been caught in the crossfire of things that had nothing to do with her. But here is what I've also come to understand. The finding still happened. Whatever broken road led to it, I found him. And he, on some level I think he's still processing, found something too. We've had dinner twice since that first phone call. Both times at a restaurant. Neutral ground. Public and unhurried. We talk like people who are learning each other's language. There are silences that are awkward, and silences that are okay, and occasionally a moment where one of us says something and the other one laughs, and there's a beat afterward where we both feel it, the strange, fragile, improbable fact of what we are to each other. I don't know what it becomes. I'm not sure he does either, but I told him the truth. That much I know I got right. And whatever comes next, whatever shape this takes, whatever slow and careful thing we're building out of wreckage and biology and 44 years of separate lives, I'm not walking away from it again. I'm 58 years old. I've got enough time left to do at least one thing right. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about the word deserve. Who deserves what? Whether the universe is actually keeping score, or whether that's just something people tell themselves to feel less helpless. I don't think the universe keeps score, but I do think our choices accumulate. I think they build up quietly over years. the way sediment does at the bottom of a river, and eventually the river changes course because of them. And we look up one day, and we're somewhere we never planned to be, and we can't quite remember all the small decisions that got us there. Loretta made choices. Small ones at first, probably. A secret kept, a feeling set aside, a line crossed and then crossed again. And I made choices too. 27 years of silence about a son I never got to know, a truth I told myself didn't need telling because enough time had passed. We were both carrying things we thought we could carry alone. And then one afternoon, all of it came due at once, in a hospital room on the 4th floor of Mercy General, and neither of us was ready. What I've come to understand, slowly, imperfectly, is that the cost of that kind of silence isn't paid all at once. It's paid in installments. A small withdrawal here, a small withdrawal there, until the account is empty and you're standing in your own kitchen looking at a woman you've shared a life with and realizing you don't fully know her, and she doesn't fully know you, and some of that is her fault, and some of it is genuinely yours. Doing the right thing when it's hard. Telling Adrian the truth, sitting across from him at a restaurant and letting him take his time. Not rushing him toward a relationship he hadn't asked for. That wasn't some grand moral gesture. It was just the thing I knew I had to do, even when I didn't know how. I had already failed him once by being too young and too afraid to fight for him. I wasn't going to fail him again by protecting my own comfort. And the clear-eyed part, the part I had to work for, the part that didn't come naturally, was accepting that my anger at Loretta, however justified, was not the most important thing in the room. The most important thing was a 44-year-old man who had just learned his entire biological history in a single letter and who needed me to show up with steadiness, not fury. I had to think past my own wound. That was harder than anything else. What carried me through it was simply refusing to stop, getting up, making the next phone call, writing the next draft of a letter I'd thrown away 7 times. Driving to that restaurant even though I didn't know what we were going to say to each other. Grief and confusion and the strange guilt of a father who missed 44 years. None of that went away. But I moved through it anyway, one day at a time, because the alternative was to leave Adrian exactly where I'd left him the first time. I'm not offering this as a lesson. I'm not in a position to teach anyone anything. I'm just a 58-year-old man who learned, later than he should have, that the truth costs less than the silence, that every secret you decide to carry alone has a weight that grows, that the people in your life, even the ones you find late, even the ones you find sideways through wreckage, are worth the discomfort of being honest with them. Adrian texted me last Tuesday. Just a photo, a fish he caught on a weekend trip up to Wisconsin. No caption. Just the photo. I looked at it for a long time. Then I set back a thumbs up and told him that was a good-sized wally. We're learning each other's language. That's enough for now.